She did not cry when they dragged her into the center of the dining hall. She did not beg when 40 pairs of eyes turned on her with contempt. She only looked at the bread in the constable's hand, the bread she had taken, and pressed her lips together so hard they turned white. Because somewhere in the woods behind this grand estate, her brother was dying, and that bread was the only thing standing between him and the grave. If this story moves you, subscribe and follow along until the very end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1815 came to Hargrove County, Virginia, like it always did. Heavy and slow, pressing down on the red clay roads and the wide tobacco fields, until the air itself felt too thick to breathe. The great estate of Whitmore Hall sat at the center of it all. 3 stories of white-painted wood and imported brick, surrounded by gardens that cost more to water in one season than most families in the county earned in a year. Nobody who worked inside those walls spoke about the cost of things. You learned that quickly. You learned a great many things quickly at Whitmore Hall. Emily Carter had learned them all in 6 months. She had learned to keep her eyes down when Lord Gerald Whitmore walked through a room because eye contact from a servant was considered impertinent. She had learned to speak only when spoken to during meals, to carry trays without letting them rattle, to answer, "Yes, ma'am," with a tone that communicated neither resentment nor too much warmth. She had learned that the other servants watched her not with friendship, but with the careful calculation of people who understood that in a household like this one, someone else's failure could mean your own survival. Most of all, she had learned how to steal food without being caught. She had been doing it for 4 months. Every third night, sometimes every second, she would wait until the kitchen fire burned low, and Mrs. Aldridge, the head cook, had retired to her room down the hall. Then Emily would wrap whatever she could fit inside her apron: cold biscuits, a heel of bread, salt pork. If there was any left, dried beans in a cloth pouch, and walk out the servants' entrance into the Virginia darkness. The walk took 40 minutes each way. She knew every root and hollow in that path by now. She could have walked it blind. In many ways, she did. The morning it all collapsed began like any other. Emily was carrying a breakfast tray to Miss Charlotte Whitmore's chamber on the 2nd floor when she heard voices coming from the landing above Charlotte's high. Certain voice, and beneath it, a deeper one she recognized immediately. Duke Nathaniel Hargrove, the most powerful man in the county, possibly in all of Western Virginia. He had arrived 2 evenings prior for what Charlotte had described to her maids as a discussion of considerable importance, which every woman in the household understood to mean that Charlotte's mother had finally maneuvered close enough to a proposal that the man himself had consented to visit. Nathaniel Hargrove was 37 years old, had inherited his title and his vast estate. Hargrove Hall, 3 miles to the east, at the age of 22, and in 15 years of managing it, had turned it from a place of quiet respectability into the largest landowning operation in the region. He was not considered warm. He was considered decisive, which in Virginia society in 1815 was a quality valued considerably above warmth. Emily did not look up as she reached the landing. She had learned not to look up. "Can't imagine why you tolerate such lax standards in your household, Charlotte," the Duke was saying. His voice was the kind that didn't need to raise itself to fill a room. "I counted 3 instances yesterday in which servants moved through the front parlor without being directed. We've had some difficulty lately with staff," Charlotte said with a practiced lightness that Emily recognized as the tone she used when she was managing someone. "You know how it is in summer. The lower quality of applicant. The quality of your applicant reflects the quality of your standards." "Yes, I suppose you're right, Nathaniel." Emily passed them with her tray and her eyes on the floor. She did not hear the Duke pause. She did not know he had looked after her. The accusation came at 11:30 that morning. She was beating a rug in the side yard when Mrs. Aldridge came through the door with 2 spots of red high on her cheeks and the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a moment and has finally arrived at it. "You," she said. "Put that down and come inside." The kitchen held 4 people when Emily entered it. Mrs. Aldridge, the undercook, Hannah, the steward, Mr. Pruitt, and Charlotte Whitmore, who was standing near the door to the dining room in a morning dress the color of cream, her arms folded across her chest. On the kitchen table sat a small cloth bundle. Emily recognized it immediately. She had last seen it tucked behind the flour barrel in the corner of the cold pantry, where she had hidden it 2 nights ago: dried beans, a fistful of salt, half a candle. Things she hadn't yet been able to carry out. "Is that yours?" Mr. Pruitt asked. She looked at it. Every thought she'd ever had about what to say in a moment like this, and she had thought about it. She had rehearsed it at night, lying on her narrow cot, had turned the possibilities over and over. Every word of it left her completely. "I can explain. She can explain," Mrs. Aldridge said to the room with the satisfaction of someone proving a long-held theory. 4 months of missing provisions and she can explain. "How long has it been going on?" Charlotte asked. Not to Emily. To Mr. Pruitt. "Hard to say precisely, Miss Whitmore. Several months. Small amounts, regular intervals. Whoever it was knew how to take without drawing immediate notice." Charlotte looked at Emily then, and Emily looked back, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You were recommended to this household," Charlotte said finally. "Your former employer, Mrs. Talmadge, spoke highly of you. She said you were honest." "I am honest." "Then explain the bundle behind my flour." Emily looked at the table. At the beans and the salt, and the half-candle wrapped in cloth with the same kind of careful economy she used every time, because every scrap mattered, because Thomas hadn't been able to keep food down for the last 3 weeks, and she had to find something he could stomach, because the doctor in town cost $4 she didn't have, and the only thing standing between her brother and a slow death was the fact that she knew how to be careful. "I can't explain it," she said. "Not in a way you'd believe." Charlotte Whitmore's expression didn't change. "I see," she said. They called for the constable. They did not wait to hear anything more from Emily. They brought her into the front parlor, not the servants' hall. The front parlor, because Charlotte seemed to feel that the formality of the room added weight to the proceeding, and they sent for Deputy Silas Crane, who arrived 20 minutes later with his hat in his hands and his eagerness showing plainly on his face. Emily sat on a wooden chair that had been placed in the center of the room. She sat straight. She had decided that much. She would not slump. She would not wring her hands. She would sit straight, and she would keep her face still, and she would not give them the theater of watching her break. The Duke was there. She had not expected that. He stood near the window on the far side of the room, not seated, not leaning, simply standing with his hands clasped behind his back and an expression of careful neutrality that revealed nothing. He had not been summoned. He had apparently chosen to attend. Charlotte stood to Emily's left near the fireplace. Mrs. Aldridge sat in a chair slightly behind and to the right, positioned like a witness ready to testify. "Well then," Deputy Crane said, rubbing his palms together with the air of a man who has been handed something he doesn't quite know what to do with. "The situation as I understand it, food gone missing from the household over a period of months stolen, you're saying, Miss Whitmore?" "I am saying," Charlotte confirmed. "And the girl, she's your servant?" "She was." Emily said nothing. Girl, Crane said, turning to her with the particular condescension of a man who believed that a title gave him authority even when it didn't. "Do you want to speak to the charge?" "I took food from this house," Emily said. "I won't deny that." The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when no one expected honesty. "Well," Crane said after a beat. "That's well. I appreciate the candor. It doesn't matter why," Charlotte said briskly. "The fact is established. The law is clear. What I want to know is what action will be taken." "Oh, the action's clear enough, Miss Whitmore. Theft of household provisions depending on the value you're looking at. A fine, possibly a custodial—" "She has no money," Charlotte said. "Obviously." Crane nodded slowly, clicking his tongue. "Well then, public censure labor." "I want her removed from the county," Charlotte said. The room went very still. Emily kept her eyes on the window, on the Duke standing at the window. He was watching Charlotte. "That's—" Crane scratched the back of his neck. Miss Whitmore, that's a significant step. Removal from county's not something done lightly. She stole from my household for 4 months, Charlotte said. She sat in my kitchen and she took food that belonged to my family, and she was given every chance to explain herself, and she refused. I want her gone. I want it made clear to every household in this county what happens when a servant takes advantage of generosity. Emily thought of Thomas. She thought of him lying on the cot she had dragged into the old Miller cabin 3 miles east, the one that had been empty since the Miller family gave up their claim and moved to Tennessee 2 winters ago. She thought of the way he looked when she found him. 6 months ago, not dead, everyone had said he was dead. The army had written him dead but alive, barely half-starved, and with a wound in his side that had healed, healed crooked, left him unable to walk more than 20 steps without sitting down. She thought of the sound he made when she brought him food, like a man who had stopped expecting anything from the world. She thought of his face when she told him she had found work at Whitmore Hall. The way relief moved through him, and then immediately the way guilt followed it, and the way she had taken his hand and told him it didn't matter. She was fine, she was perfectly fine. The work was easy and the wages were good, and he only needed to rest and get strong. She had told him the wages were good. The wages were barely enough to keep herself fed. She had not told him that part. "Ma'am," Emily said. Charlotte looked at her. "The food didn't go to waste," Emily said. "It fed someone who needed it. I'm not going to tell you that makes the taking right. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking you to consider that there might be more to a situation than what's visible in a parlor." Silence. Charlotte's expression moved through something just for a moment, just the flicker of it before settling back into its cool certainty. "Remove her from the premises," she said to Crane. They walked her through the front door, not the servants' entrance. The front door, which Emily recognized as deliberate, because Charlotte understood that the point was to be seen, and the staff had gathered, some trying to look like they weren't in the main hall, and 2 of the stable hands were outside in the drive, and the gardener's boy was pretending to trim something near the gate. The sun hit her face when she came out. She stopped at the top of the steps and let it. She didn't have a plan. She had understood in the abstract that this moment might come, had understood it with the part of her mind she kept locked behind everything else, the part that calculated and prepared for disasters. But understanding a disaster in the abstract is very different from standing in it. Thomas couldn't walk far. He needed food tonight. He needed food this afternoon, probably. She had 14 cents in her pocket and a change of clothes in a cloth sack that Crane was handing her now, with the expression of a man who wished he was somewhere else. "You'll want to move on," Crane said, not unkindly. "Best not to linger." "I know," she said. She stepped down. "Done. Miss Carter." The voice came from behind her. She turned. The Duke stood on the top step. He had followed them out, had been following, she realized, perhaps since the parlor, and he stood there now with his hat in his hand and the sunlight on him, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read at all. "I'm not in the habit of involving myself in household matters," he said. "Then don't," she said. A short silence. "You're not from here originally," he said. "Your speech is northern, Massachusetts possibly." "Virginia," she said. "Originally." "You were educated." It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "My father believed in educating his daughters." "Your father?" "He died 3 years ago. If you're building toward a point, Your Grace, I'd ask you to build faster. I have somewhere I need to be." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze. She was tired. Too tired in that moment to perform the deference she'd been performing for 6 months, and some of that tiredness must have shown because something shifted slightly in his expression. Not pity. She didn't think he was capable of pity in the ordinary sense. Something more like attention. "Where do you need to be?" he asked. "That's my business," she said. "It is," he agreed. "But you just walked out of a household in the middle of the county with nothing but a change of clothes and 14 cents. I couldn't help but notice. And somewhere you need to be is a statement that implies a destination, and I find myself curious about it." Emily stared at him. "Are you going to have me arrested?" she asked flatly. "No." "Then I'll be going." She turned and walked toward the gate. He didn't follow, but she heard him, just before she was through it, say something to Deputy Crane, too low for her to make out the words, and she heard Crane say, "Yes, Your Grace," in the tone of a man redirected. She didn't look back. She found Thomas asleep. He slept badly most nights, and sometimes into the afternoon, and she had learned to gauge his fever by the sound of his breathing before she even got the door open. If it was too fast and shallow, she knew. If it was slow and even, she allowed herself to exhale. It was slow and even now. She set her sack down against the wall and sat on the edge of the cot and looked at him for a moment. He was thinner than he'd been in July when she'd first found him. She told herself it was the heat, that nobody ate well in this heat, that when autumn came he would gain it back. She told herself a lot of things about Thomas. He opened his eyes. "Em," he said. "I'm here," she said. He looked at her face for a moment, the same way he'd been looking at her since he was 3 years old, and she was 2.5, and he'd figured out that she was his person, the one who could not hide anything from him. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing." "Emily." She put her hands in her lap. Outside the single window, the light was moving toward afternoon. "I was let go," she said. He was quiet. "Why?" he asked, though she could see from his face that he already knew that he had known in some part of himself for a while now, and had been refusing to look at it directly. "It doesn't matter," she said. "I'll find another position." "Emily." His voice was very low. "Tell me what you're not telling me." She looked at her hands. "They found the food," she said. "I was careful, Tom. I was so careful. But Mrs. Aldridge had been keeping inventory, and she noticed the amounts weren't adding up, and they found a bundle I'd hidden in the pantry and—" She stopped. "It doesn't matter. It's done." Thomas put his hand over his face. "Tom, you should have left me," he said from behind his hand. "Emily, you should have—" "Don't," she said. "I'm telling you, and I'm telling you don't." Her voice came out steady. She was very proud of that in the moment. "You're my brother. You came home. Half the men who went didn't come home, and you did, and I am not leaving you in a cabin to die, while I go find myself a comfortable position somewhere. So we're going to stop this conversation right now, and we're going to figure out what comes next." Thomas lowered his hand. He looked at her. "What do we have?" he asked after a long silence. 14 cents, she said. "A change of clothes, and whatever's left in the corner from last week." "That's almost nothing, Em." "I know," she said, "but I've started with less." She had been back at the cabin for perhaps an hour when she heard hoofbeats on the road. She was up before the sound fully registered. 6 months of listening for things that meant danger had made her fast, and she was standing near the door looking through the gap between the frame and the wall when the horse came into view. It was a very good horse. The kind of horse that cost more than her father's farm had been worth in its last good year. The man on it she recognized immediately. Duke Nathaniel Hargrove sat on the horse with the ease of someone who had grown up on horseback and never stopped, and he was looking directly at the cabin. Emily's hand found the door handle. She pressed herself against the wall. "Miss Carter," the Duke said. He didn't raise his voice. He said it the way you'd speak to someone you knew was within earshot. She stayed silent. "I followed your tracks from the road," he said. "The clay's soft today. You might want to account for that in future." A pause. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I want to talk to you. I'm asking you to open the door." From the cot, Thomas made a sound not quite a word more, the shift of someone waking to the presence of a stranger, and she heard him say quietly, "Em." "It's all right," she said. She wasn't sure it was. She opened the door. The Duke stood outside it. He had left the horse tied at the tree line and walked the rest of the way, which meant he had been watching the cabin for at least a few minutes before he spoke. He looked at her, and then his gaze moved past her to the interior of the cabin, and she watched the particular quality of stillness that came over him as he registered what was inside. Thomas on the cot, the bowls she'd cleaned and stacked in the corner, the jars of medicine she'd scraped together, 3 of them, 2 nearly empty. The chart on the wall where she'd been recording his fever in a hand so small she'd had to hold the candle close to see it. The Duke looked at all of it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. "Your brother," he said, quietly. She said nothing. "The army listed him as dead," he said. Still nothing. "That's why you took the food," he said. "Not for yourself, for him." She lifted her chin. "Does it matter?" "Yes," he said. "It matters considerably." He took his hat off. It was such a simple gesture, and she would think about it for a long time afterward, the way he did it, without drama, without making a performance of it, just took it off and held it in both hands. "My brother died in the war," he said. 3 years ago. His name was Robert. He was 24. Emily went very still. "I received a letter." The Duke continued, his voice even and careful. "Battlefield. 2 days of fighting, 1 letter. No second chance to look for him. No opportunity to go, and—" He stopped, started again. "There was no body to bring home." Silence. From inside, Thomas shifted on his cot. "So you understand," Emily said slowly, "what it is to not accept a letter." "Yes," he said. "I do." She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, a bird was calling somewhere in the tree line. The same 3-note pattern over and over, and somewhere farther off the low sound of the creek running through the eastern edge of the property. "What do you want?" she asked. "To help," he said. "In exchange for what?" He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Carter," he said, "I know you have no particular reason to trust me. I know your experience of powerful men in this county is largely their capacity to make your life worse. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to accept that I have a doctor I can send here by tomorrow morning, provisions that won't come short, and enough authority in this county that no deputy is going to come through that door if I say otherwise." He paused. "I'm asking you to let me help him, that's all. No conditions, no exchange." She stared at him. "Why?" she asked. He looked past her again to where Thomas lay. "Because I would have wanted someone to help mine," he said. "And no one did." Emily stood in the doorway of that small cabin in the Virginia summer heat, with her 14 cents and her empty hands, and the exhaustion of 6 months of carrying everything alone, and she felt something move through her chest that she could not immediately name. It was not trust. She was not capable of trust yet, but it was something. "I need to talk to my brother," she said. "Of course," said the Duke. She turned back inside. She left the door open. Thomas did not say anything for a long moment after Emily told him. She sat on the edge of his cot, and she told him everything. The Duke, the horse, the offer, the words he had spoken in the doorway about his brother Robert, about wanting someone to have helped and no one doing it. She told it plainly, without decoration, the way she told Thomas most things, because he had always been able to tell when she was softening something, and it annoyed him. When she finished, he stared at the ceiling. "He followed you," Thomas said. "Yes. From the Whitmore estate. He said the clay was soft. He tracked me." Thomas turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were the same gray-green as their father's, and when he looked at her like that, steady measuring, he reminded her so much of a man who had been gone 3 years that it made her chest ache. "And you trust him," Thomas said. "I didn't say that." "Emily, you left the door open." She looked down at her hands. "I don't know what I did," she said honestly. "I only know that he took his hat off and he told me about Robert, and it didn't sound like a man manufacturing sympathy. It sounded like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and set it down for just a moment." She paused. "I could be wrong." "You're not usually wrong about people," Thomas said. "I'm not usually this tired either." He reached out and put his hand over hers. His grip was weaker than it used to be. She noticed that every time, and every time she told herself not to, but it was still there, still warm. "What did you tell him?" Thomas asked. That I needed to talk to you. And now you have. And now I have." Thomas was quiet for another long moment. Outside the door still open, she'd left it open, she could hear the Duke somewhere near the tree line, not pacing, just present the occasional shift of his boots on the dry ground. "Let him send the doctor," Thomas said finally. "Tom. M." His voice was quiet but firm. "I'm not getting better on my own. You know that and I know that, and we've both been pretending otherwise for 2 months. Let him send the doctor." She pressed her lips together. "And if there's a cost to it, we haven't seen yet?" she asked. "Then we deal with it when we see it," he said. "But right now, the thing in front of us is a man standing outside our door saying he wants to help. And I'd rather take the chance than die in here waiting for certainty." Emily looked at her brother's face, at the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, at the hollows in his cheeks, at the careful way he held himself, even lying down like a man rationing every movement. "All right," she said. She stood up and went back to the door. The Duke was standing exactly where she'd left him, which she had half expected and half not. He looked at her when she appeared in the doorway, and he didn't ask the question, which she appreciated. He simply waited. "He'll see the doctor," she said, "and we'll accept the provisions, but I want something clear between us." "Name it," he said. "I'm not in your debt," she said. "I'm not going to be in your debt, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. And if at any point what you're offering comes attached to something you haven't mentioned, I want you to tell me now instead of later, because I can manage now. I'm not sure I can manage later." He looked at her steadily. "It comes attached to nothing," he said. "You have my word." "Your word," she repeated. "I understand that may not mean much to you yet," he said. "I'm giving it anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. "The doctor," she said. "Tomorrow morning." "I'll send for him tonight. He'll be here at first light." She nodded once and started to close the door and then stopped. "Your Grace," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "For the hat." He blinked. She closed the door. Dr. Elias Marsh arrived at sunrise. He was a compact, efficient man in his early 60s with sharp eyes and the particular manner of a physician who had seen enough suffering to stop being surprised by it without becoming indifferent to it. He came with a leather bag that clinked softly when he set it on the floor beside Thomas's cot, and he asked clear, direct questions in a voice that contained no judgment whatsoever. Emily answered all of them. She had been keeping notes for months. The fever chart on the wall, a small record book she'd started in January with dates and temperatures, and the foods Thomas could and couldn't keep down the exact timeline of his wound, and what had happened when she'd tried to clean it in the first weeks. She pulled it out and handed it to Marsh, without being asked, and something moved through his face when he took it a quick recalibration, the adjustment of a man who had arrived expecting one thing and encountered another. "You did this yourself," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "There was no one else," Emily said. Marsh nodded slowly, paging through the small book. Then he set it down and turned to Thomas and began his examination, and Emily sat in the corner near the door and kept her hands in her lap, and focused on breathing evenly while a stranger touched her brother's side, and her brother did not make a sound, though she could see from the line of his jaw what it cost him. "The wound healed incorrectly," Marsh said after a while. "I know," Emily said. "You knew it at the time." "I suspected it. I didn't have the skill to correct it." Marsh looked at her. "Do you know what correcting it involves?" She'd thought about this. She'd read what she could find, had borrowed a medical text from the lending library in town by telling the librarian it was for a class she was teaching, which was not entirely false since she was teaching herself. "It needs to be reopened," she said, "and reset. It's the only way the muscle heals properly." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "Can you do it?" "Yes, but not today. He needs to be stronger first, better fed, better rested. I want to see him in 3 weeks. If he gains back some weight and keeps his fever down, we can look at the procedure." He closed his bag and stood. "In the meantime, He wrote something on a small card and held it out to Emily. This compound twice daily. You can make it yourself, the ingredients aren't rare. And he needs to eat. Protein, not bread. Actual meat eggs if you can get them. Emily looked at the card. I'll get them, she said. She did not look up from the card when she said it because she was doing the arithmetic in her head, and it did not resolve in any direction she could see, and she did not want Marsh to see her doing it. She heard the door open. The doctor left. And then from outside, she heard his voice and the Duke's voice, low, exchanging information, and then the creak of the Duke's horse moving away, and then silence. She stood in the middle of the cabin with the card in her hand, and she made herself breathe for a count of 10. Thomas said. I'm fine, she said. You don't have to be fine right now. Yes, she said. I do. The provisions arrived that afternoon. Not a small delivery. Not a careful, measured amount chosen to establish a relationship of comfortable dependency. A crate of salt, pork, dried beans, cornmeal rice, a wrapped parcel of smoked fish. A small wooden box that turned out to contain 6 eggs packed in sawdust, and at the very bottom, tucked in without ceremony, a twist of paper containing dried chamomile, and something that smelled like the compound Marsh had written on the card. Emily stood in the open doorway and looked at it all for a long moment. She looked at it the way you look at something that rearranges the inside of your chest without asking permission. Then she carried it inside item by item, and she stacked it against the wall, and she started a fire, and she made Thomas eat a proper meal for the first time in 3 weeks, and when he fell asleep that night with more color in his face than she'd seen in months, she sat in the dark and felt something crack very quietly inside her. Not grief, not quite. It was the feeling of something held for a very long time, finally being set down for a moment. She didn't cry, she sat with it. And in the morning, she got up and she started figuring out what came next. What came next, as it turned out, was Charlotte Whitmore. Emily had expected in the abstract that word would travel. It always did in a county this size. The story of the dismissed servant was too good not to pass along, and Charlotte was not the kind of woman who told a story quietly. But she had not expected the particular shape the story took as it moved through Hargrove County, and she had not expected it to move quite this fast. She was in town 3 days later at the dry goods store on Market Street, buying a small amount of salt with the last of her 14 cents when she heard her name. Not spoken to her. Spoken about her. Carter girl. Yes, the one from Whitmore Hall. Heard she was caught stealing, and not just food. They said there was money missing as well. Always something wrong with the quiet ones. Emily did not turn around. She put her coins on the counter and accepted her paper twist of salt from the storekeeper and walked out. She walked 2 blocks before she stopped and stood against the side of a building and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just heard. Money. They were saying money. She had taken food. She had never taken a single coin from that household, not once. Not even when she had found a $50 that had rolled under the sideboard in the second parlor and lay there for a week before someone noticed, and she could have pocketed it easily, and no one would have known. She had picked it up and left it on the mantel. But Charlotte Whitmore was telling a story now, and the story had grown in the telling, and there was nothing Emily could do about it, because she was a dismissed servant with nowhere to live, and no employer reference, and 14 cents, now 0 cents to her name. She went back to the cabin. She did not tell Thomas. She told herself she would figure it out. She was good at figuring things out. It was the one quality she had always counted on the part of herself that didn't panic, that looked at what was available and asked what could be done with it. Her father had called it her accounting mind. She thought of it less romantically. It was just the habit of someone who had learned early that if she didn't solve the problem, it stayed unsolved. She had a brother who needed a surgery in 3 weeks. She had no income, no position, no reference. She had a benefactor she didn't quite trust, and a story circulating through the county that had just acquired a detail that hadn't happened. She could go to another county, find work somewhere without a reputation attached to her name. But Thomas couldn't travel, not yet. She could try to find day work nearby laundry, mending, cleaning for households that wouldn't ask for references from the immediate area. But that would take time to arrange, and Marsh had been very clear about the timeline. She could go back to the Duke. She sat with that option for a long time. Going back to him felt like walking towards something with her eyes open, which was different from stumbling into it, and different again from being pushed. She had at least the small dignity of choosing. She spent the night thinking. In the morning, she walked to Hargrove Hall. The estate was larger than she'd expected, which was saying something since she'd expected it to be large. 3 times the size of Whitmore Hall, with a working operation visible in every direction. Outbuildings, a stable that held at least a dozen horses, fields stretching east that she could not see the end of. The house itself was older than the Whitmore place, less polished, more solidly built, the kind of structure that had been put up to last rather than to impress. She went to the front door. She wasn't sure why habit would have taken her to the servants' entrance, but she'd been dismissed from service, which meant she was technically a caller, and she decided in the moment that she was going to conduct herself accordingly. The man who opened the door was perhaps 50, with the bearing of a longtime house steward, and the expression of someone who had seen many things arrive on this doorstep and was not particularly surprised by any of them. "I need to speak with the Duke," Emily said. "My name is Emily Carter. He knows who I am." The steward, whose name she would later learn was Gerald Fitch, looked at her for a moment. "If you'll wait in the front hall," he said, and stood back. She waited. The hall was plain, in the way expensive things sometimes are, nothing unnecessary. Everything of good quality, worn in ways that indicated use rather than neglect. She stood in the middle of it and did not look around too much, because looking around too much was the habit of people who expected to be impressed, and she had decided she was not going to be impressed. The Duke appeared in 3 minutes. He came from the direction of what she guessed was a study, and he was carrying a sheaf of papers he set on a side table when he saw her, and he looked at her with an expression that was very focused and contained no surprise whatsoever. "Miss Carter," he said. "I need to work," she said. "I need a position. I won't ask you for charity again, that's not what this is. I need legitimate employment with a wage, and I need a reference I can use when Thomas is well enough to travel and we leave this county. In exchange, I'll work as hard as you need me to, and I won't cause you any trouble, and I'll be honest with you about what I can and can't do." She paused. "That's the offer." He was quiet. "Charlotte Whitmore is telling people I stole money," Emily said. "I didn't, but that's what they're hearing. So I need something documented. Employment records. Something in writing with your name on it. When this is over, I need to be able to go somewhere and have that paper be worth something." Still quiet. "You said you wanted to help," she said. "This is how you help." The Duke looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Can you manage household accounts?" "Yes." "Estate records correspondence?" "Yes." "I have a library that needs cataloging. The previous housekeeper began the project and left it unfinished. It's not glamorous work." "I'm not looking for glamour," Emily said. "No," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. "I don't imagine you are." He looked at her steadily. $2 a week, room and board in the house. Written employment record from the first day, signed by me. You work library hours during the day. I'll give you time to visit your brother in the evenings, provided the work is done." Emily's breath went very still. $2 a week was almost twice what Whitmore had been paying her. "And the reference?" she asked. "Documented," he said. "Whatever you need it to say." She stood in the front hall of Hargrove Hall and looked at this man who had followed her into the woods 2 days ago and found everything she'd been hiding for 6 months. And she thought about what Thomas had said, that she'd left the door open. "When do I start?" she asked. "Now suits me," he said. She went to get Thomas's agreement first. He gave it in the same way he gave most things, without drama, with a single long look at her face that communicated everything he was not going to say out loud. "Be careful," he said. "I'm always careful. Emily, be careful with yourself, not just with him, with yourself. She knew what he meant. "I'll be back this evening," she said. The library at Hargrove Hall was a room of approximately 30 feet by 20, lined on 3 walls, with shelves that reached the ceiling, and those shelves held books in the particular state of entropy that happens when a collection is actively used rather than curated. Things in the wrong places. Things stacked horizontally because there wasn't room vertically. Things shoved in with their spines facing backward. Things that clearly belonged to different systems that had been started and abandoned over decades. The previous housekeeper had gotten as far as creating a ledger with about 200 entries before apparently being defeated by the scale of the thing. Emily stood in the center of the room the first morning and looked at all of it. Then she sat down, opened the ledger to the first entry, pulled the nearest stack of books toward her, and started. She liked this kind of work. She always had. The quiet logic of it, the question of what organizing principle made sense, the satisfaction of a row straightening beneath her hands. Her father had had a small library of perhaps 60 books, and she had organized it 3 different ways between the ages of 9 and 12 before settling on the system that served him best. She was 2 hours into the Hargrove cataloging when the Duke came in. He did not announce himself. He came in the way a man comes into a room he spends time in with a natural ease, moving to the far end where there was a large table covered in papers. He sat down and opened something and began reading. Emily kept working. For perhaps 20 minutes, neither of them said anything. Then the Duke said, without looking up from his papers, "The previous housekeeper put them in order of acquisition, year by year as they were purchased. She felt this was the most logical system." "It isn't," Emily said. He looked up. "A library organized by acquisition date tells you about the buyer's habits," she said. "It doesn't help you find a book. I'm organizing by subject first, then author alphabetically within subject. You'll be able to find what you need in under a minute once it's complete." He looked at her for a moment. "How long will it take?" he asked. 3 weeks, she said. "Maybe 4, depending on what I find in the far stacks. There's a section behind the eastern wall that I haven't reached yet. There are maps behind the eastern shelves," he said. "Survey maps mostly, 40 years of them." "Those will need their own section," she said. "Chronological with a cross-reference to the subject catalog." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That would work." He went back to his papers. Emily went back to her books. Outside, the summer heat was building toward noon. It was on the 4th day that Charlotte arrived. Emily was in the library when she heard the front bell and then voices in the hall. Charlotte's voice, which was the kind of voice that carried without the speaker intending it to, and beneath it, Fitch's measured response, and then the sound of the sitting room door opening. She stayed in the library. 20 minutes passed. Then she heard footsteps in the hall. Charlotte's, she thought, quick and deliberate, and the sitting room door opening again, and then Charlotte's voice, closer now, saying something that Emily caught only a fragment of. "Think I don't know what you're doing, Nathaniel." And the Duke's voice, very calm. "What I'm doing is managing my household. You hired her to make a point. I hired her because she's competent." A pause. Emily stood very still in the library with a book in her hands. "Everyone in the county is watching," Charlotte said. "You understand that. What you do with that girl reflects on Charlotte." His voice was still calm. It was a different kind of calm than silence she was beginning to understand. Not absence of feeling, but presence of control, which was a distinction that mattered. "What happens in my household does not reflect on anyone except me. I'll ask you to remember that." Silence. "She stole from my house," Charlotte said. "She took food," the Duke said. "To feed her wounded brother, a soldier who served this country. Those are not equivalent to theft in any ledger I keep." Another silence longer. Then Charlotte said something too low for Emily to hear. Then the front door. Then the sound of a horse on the drive moving away. Emily stood in the library for another moment. She set the book down on the catalog table and smoothed the page and marked her place. He had said it plainly, to Charlotte's face, in his own front hallway. She had not asked him to do that. She had not expected it. She picked up the book again and went back to work. What she had not expected either was Martha Gill. Martha was one of the housemaids at Hargrove Hall, the kind of woman who managed to be present in a room in a way that seemed accidental until you noticed how much information she had accumulated by being there. She was perhaps 35, dark-haired with quick hands and a dry laugh, and on Emily's 5th day, she appeared in the library doorway with a cup of tea and the expression of someone delivering something while pretending not to be delivering it. "I thought you might want this," she said. "Thank you," Emily said. Martha didn't leave. She stood in the doorway with her hands wrapped around her own cup and looked at the organized section of the library, about a third done now, rows of books standing straight in their new order. "You're fast," Martha said. "I'm motivated," Emily said. Martha nodded. She seemed to be working up to something. "There are people in this house who are glad you're here," she said finally. "I want you to know that. Not all the talk is like what's going around town." Emily looked at her. "What's going around town has gotten louder," Martha said. "Charlotte Whitmore's been busy this week. You should know that. I'm not saying it to frighten you. I'm saying it because you look like a woman who wants to know things rather than be surprised by them." "I do," Emily said. "They're saying you're living here to get close to him," Martha said plainly. "Saying you set it up. That the story about the brother is not a lie exactly, but exaggerated, made more sympathetic than it is." Emily was quiet. "Are they?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And what do the people in this house say?" Martha smiled, just slightly. "The people in this house have seen how you work and how you talk and how you won't take anything you haven't earned. The people in this house are forming their own opinion." Emily looked at her for a moment. "What's your name?" she asked. "Martha Gill." "Thank you, Martha," Emily said. "For the tea and for the information both." Martha nodded and left, and Emily sat with the tea for a moment, before setting it aside and reaching for the next stack of books. The story had grown again. She had expected it might. Charlotte Whitmore was not a stupid woman. She was a woman who understood that narrative was a weapon, and that the best way to use it was not all at once, but gradually, with additions that seemed plausible, that built on what people already half believed. First, a servant who stole food. Now a servant who had manufactured a sympathetic story to position herself near a wealthy man. Next would be something worse. She was sure of it. She found out what the next thing was on the 8th day. She was walking back from the cabin she went every evening, stayed until Thomas was settled for the night when she came through the backfield and found the Duke standing outside the stable. She nearly walked past him. He spoke first. "A moment," he said. Something in his voice made her stop. He was holding a folded piece of paper. "This was left at my front gate this afternoon," he said. "I thought you should see it before anyone else did." She took it and read it. It was not long. 8 sentences. It claimed, in the careful anonymous penmanship of someone who wanted to sound objective, that Emily Carter had been dismissed from 2 previous households for theft, not just Whitmore Hall, but a family in Fredericksburg, the year before. It named a specific amount, $11. It claimed that she had a habit of using personal stories to earn sympathy from employers. It was signed, "A Concerned Citizen of Hargrove County." Emily read it twice. Then she folded it precisely along its original crease and handed it back. "The family in Fredericksburg doesn't exist," she said. "I was never in Fredericksburg." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You know," she said. "I had someone check the morning after you asked me for the position," he said. "Your history before Whitmore Hall, the family you worked for in Culpeper, and the one before that in Alexandria." He paused. "Clean record in both places. The Culpeper family would have given you a reference, but you didn't ask them." "I didn't want to involve anyone else," she said. "I didn't know what the situation might become." "Yes," he said. "I gathered that. She looked at the paper in his hands. "Who do you think sent it?" she asked, though she already knew. "I have a strong suspicion," he said, "and no proof. Those things sometimes require patience." Emily thought about the word patience. She had been patient for 6 months. She had been patient and quiet and careful, and it had still ended in a parlor with 40 people looking at her. "What do you intend to do?" she asked. "Nothing yet," he said. "But I want you to know it exists, and I want you to know that it changed nothing here." She looked at him for a long moment. "You checked my history," she said, "before you offered me the position." "Yes." "That's not nothing," she said. "That's due diligence." "That's also the action of a man who wanted to be certain before he put his name to something," he said. "I don't offer my name lightly." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "Good night, Your Grace," and walked toward the house. She lay awake a long time that night, not because she was frightened. She was past a certain kind of fear, now had moved through it into something harder and quieter. Not because she was angry though she kept it in the locked room at the back of her mind where she put things that had to wait. She lay awake because she was beginning to understand that this situation, this careful balance she'd been walking, was not going to stay balanced much longer. Charlotte Whitmore had made a decision. Emily could see the shape of it clearly now. The way you can see the shape of a storm from a distance before it arrives, the escalating narrative, the anonymous letter, the visit to Hargrove Hall. Charlotte was not going to stop. Charlotte believed that she was protecting something real, her position, her prospect, her idea of how the world was supposed to be ordered, and people protecting something real were more dangerous than people acting from simple malice, because they believed they were right. Emily stared at the ceiling and thought about what Thomas had said. "Be careful with yourself." She understood now what he'd been warning her about. It wasn't the Duke she needed to be careful with. It was the part of herself that had noticed the hat. The part that had catalogued the exact way he'd spoken to Charlotte in the hall. The precise words "not theft" in any ledger I keep, and turned them over quietly in the back of her mind. The part that noticed he'd checked her history not to use it against her but to know her, and that these were different things. She had not let herself feel much of anything for a long time. There was too much to manage, too much to carry. But something was happening very quietly in the margin of everything else. She pressed her eyes shut and told herself to sleep. In the morning, Thomas's fever was down 2 full degrees. Marsh, who came to check him that afternoon, called it progress. Emily stood in the doorway of the cabin and let the word move through her. Progress. It was enough. For now, it was enough. She did not see the Duke for 2 days after the letter. He was in town. Fitch told her for business, related to the fall land leases routine, apparently the kind of thing that took him away for days at a time. Emily worked in the library, and she helped Martha with the linen inventory when she finished early. And in the evenings, she went to Thomas and came back and did not think too carefully about the particular quality of quiet the house had when the Duke was not in it. She was in the library on the afternoon of the second day when she heard the front bell. And then voices. And then Fitch's footsteps measured and unhurried coming down the hall toward the library door. He stopped in the doorway. "Miss Carter," he said, "there are 2 men here to see you." Emily set down the book. "What kind of men?" she asked. "They say they're from the county circuit court," Fitch said. His voice was entirely even. "They have a summons." The room was very quiet. Emily thought of the anonymous letter. She thought of Charlotte Whitmore busy this week, Martha had said. She thought of $11 and a family in Fredericksburg that didn't exist. She stood up. "Tell them I'll be right there," she said. She smoothed her apron. She stood up straight, and she walked out to meet them. The 2 men from the county circuit court were not unkind. That was the first thing Emily noticed, and she filed it away, the way she filed everything quickly, quietly, in the part of her mind that was always cataloging, always assessing what she had to work with. They were not unkind, but they were not comfortable either. The younger one, who couldn't have been more than 25, kept his eyes on his papers. The older one, a man named Deputy Surveyor Holt, had the look of someone who had been handed a task he hadn't chosen and intended to discharge it correctly, regardless of how he felt about it. "Miss Emily Carter," Holt said. "Yes," she said. "A formal complaint has been filed with the Circuit Court of Hargrove County regarding theft of household property from the estate of Gerald Whitmore, deceased, currently managed by Miss Charlotte Whitmore." He read from the paper without inflection, which she appreciated. The complaint alleges theft of monetary funds in the amount of $11.30 in addition to provisions over a period of approximately 4 months. You are hereby summoned to appear before Justice Harold Kane at the county courthouse on the 14th of August at 10 o'clock in the morning to answer the complaint. He held out the paper. Emily took it. Her hand did not shake. She was very deliberate about that. "Who filed the complaint?" she asked. "Miss Charlotte Whitmore," Holt said. "I see." Emily looked at the summons. August 14th, 9 days. "And the monetary claim, the $11.30. What documentation does the complaint provide?" Holt exchanged a brief glance with the younger man. "That would be a matter for the court proceeding," he said carefully. "Of course," Emily said. "Thank you for delivering this in person." Holt looked at her for a moment, a real look, not the official one. "Ma'am," he said, and there was something in it she couldn't entirely decode, something that might have been sympathy or might have been warning. "I'd advise you to secure representation if you can." "Thank you," she said again. She stood in the hallway and held the summons until she heard the front door close behind them. Then she sat down on the bench along the wall and looked at the paper in her hands. $11.30. She thought about every coin she had handled in the Whitmore household. She had never held $11.30 all at once in her entire time there. The household cash box was kept by Mr. Pruitt, and she had no access to it, had never been given access to it, had never been in the room alone when it was open. Charlotte knew that. Charlotte knew that perfectly well, which meant Charlotte was betting on something other than the truth. She was betting on the story. She heard the Duke before she saw him. He came in through the side entrance back from town. She realized she'd heard the horse in the stable yard 10 minutes ago, and his boots were quick on the floor, which was not his usual pace, which meant Fitch had told him before he'd even had his coat off. He came around the corner and saw her on the bench with the summons in her hands. He stopped. "Show me," he said. She held it out. He read it standing up, which took about 15 seconds, and then he held it for a moment longer than the reading required, and she watched something move through his face. Not shock, not quite anger, something more considered than either of those. "She filed a monetary claim," he said. "Yes." "There's no documentation for a monetary claim," he said. "She has none. I'd stake considerable on that." "So would I," Emily said. "She's not filing this to win it." He looked at her. "She's filing it to make it public," Emily said. "A formal court proceeding. Names read aloud, complaint read into the record. Whatever happens at the hearing, the story gets told in front of everyone who matters in this county. And the story, regardless of the verdict, is—" She stopped. She could hear how flat her voice had gone, and she made herself slow down. "The story is the servant who stole from one household, came to live in another wealthy household, and then a formal theft complaint was filed. The proximity tells its own tale." He was quiet for a moment. "She's trying to damage both of us," he said. "She's trying to remove me," Emily said. "You're the secondary concern." He looked at her steadily. "You're not going to run," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. "Good." He set the summons on the bench beside her. "Because running would tell the story she wants told. Staying and answering it tells a different one." He paused. "I'm going to ride to Charlottesville tomorrow. There's a lawyer there, a man named Aldous Crew, who handles circuit cases. He's the best in this part of Virginia." "I can't afford a lawyer from Charlottesville," Emily said. "I'm not asking you to pay for him. Your Grace. Miss Carter. His voice was even but firm. We have had this conversation. There are no conditions. This is different, she said. This is a legal proceeding. If you pay for my defense, then people will talk, he said. Yes, they'll talk regardless. The question is whether you walk into that courtroom with the best defense available, or the defense you can personally afford, which is nothing. He held her gaze. The answer to that question seems clear to me. She looked at him. She thought about Thomas. She thought about 9 days. All right, she said. Good, he said, and picked up his coat from where he'd set it on the hall table, and went to find Fitch to arrange the morning's ride, and she was left on the bench with the summons and the particular feeling of watching a man decide something and act on it without ceremony. She stayed there for a while longer than she needed to. She told Thomas that evening. She had debated not telling him, had spent the walk through the East Field turning over the question of how much he needed to know right now, when his fever was finally down, and Marsh had said 3 weeks, and every piece of good news felt fragile. But she had never kept things from Thomas in any way that mattered, and she wasn't going to start now. He took it better than she expected, and worse than she hoped. Better because he didn't rage. Worse because of what replaced it, a kind of quiet that she recognized as the silence of a man blaming himself for something he couldn't change. Tom, she said. Don't, he said. It's not, Emily. He turned his head and looked at her, and his jaw was tight. I know what you're going to say. You're going to say it isn't my fault, and you'd have done it anyway, and it doesn't matter. But my sister is being dragged into a courthouse because she was keeping me alive, and I need a minute to sit with that before you try to talk me out of feeling it. She was quiet. She gave him the minute. Then she said, Are you done? He let out a long breath. Almost, he said. Take your time, she said, and meant it. He was quiet for another moment. Who is this lawyer? He asked. Someone from Charlottesville. The Duke is fetching him tomorrow. The Duke, Thomas said. Not with suspicion exactly. With the tone of a man who has been accumulating information about someone and is waiting to see if the picture resolves. Yes, Emily said. He's done a good deal for us, Thomas said. He has. Why? She thought about how to answer that. I think, she said carefully, that he is a man who has spent a long time being powerful and finding it insufficient. And I think that helping someone, actually helping in a way that requires something of him, is filling a space that power left empty. Thomas looked at her. That's a generous reading of a rich man's motivations, he said. Maybe, she said. Or maybe it's accurate. I'm still deciding. He was quiet. Be careful, he said. You've said that. I'll keep saying it, he said, until I'm sure you've heard it. She took his hand. I've heard it, she said. Aldous Crewe arrived on the 6th day before the hearing. He was younger than Emily had expected, perhaps 40, with the compact energy of a man who thought faster than he spoke and was accustomed to other people catching up. He shook her hand, which surprised her, and then he sat down across from her at the library table and opened a leather folio and said, Tell me everything. Start at the beginning and don't leave anything out because you think it makes you look bad. I need the version that actually happened, not the version that sounds best. She told him everything. It took an hour. He didn't interrupt. He made notes in small, rapid handwriting and asked questions only when she paused, sharp questions, the kind that cut to what was underneath rather than what was on the surface. When she finished, he sat back and looked at his notes. The monetary claim is fabricated, he said. Yes. Can you prove it? I can tell you every room in that household I was permitted to enter, and the cash box was in none of them. If Prewitt the steward testifies honestly, he'll confirm I had no access. Will he testify honestly? Emily thought about Mr. Prewitt, his expression at the kitchen table when they'd laid out the bundle, the way he'd presented the inventory records, careful and factual without editorializing. I think so, she said. He's not a man who embellishes. I'll need to speak with him before the hearing, Crewe said. The provision taking you've admitted to, That's the part she can actually prove, and that we need to address directly rather than deflect. What's your defense? The truth, Emily said. The truth is not always a defense in a courtroom, Crew said not unkindly. Courts deal in precedent documentation and witnesses. What documentation do you have? She went to her room and came back with the record book. The fever charts, the dates. The notes she'd kept on Thomas's condition, each entry marked with what she'd brought and when. Crew looked through it. His expression shifted slightly. You kept contemporaneous records, he said. I wanted to know if what I was doing was working, she said. Miss Carter. Crew said, this document establishes a consistent pattern of conduct over 4 months, including dates, quantities, and the direct purpose of the food taken. A judge looking at this does not see a thief. He sees a woman running a care operation out of a household pantry. He looked up. It's not nothing. It's actually quite significant. Will it be enough? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. It depends on the judge, he said. And on how well Charlotte Whitmore tells her story. And on whether Prewitt talks. He closed the folio. But I've seen thinner cases walk out of that courthouse clean. The night before the hearing, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay on her cot in the room Hargrove Hall had given her plain walls. One window, a good mattress that was still strange to her after months of the cabin floor. And she stared at the dark and let herself feel what she'd been managing all week. She was afraid. She was genuinely, specifically afraid, not of jail. Crew had told her that was unlikely, and she believed him. She was afraid of the courtroom, of standing in a room full of people who had already decided what she was and being required to prove otherwise with nothing but her own voice and a small record book and a lawyer she'd met 6 days ago. She was afraid of Thomas watching it happen, because Thomas would be there. He'd told her so 2 nights ago in the voice he used when something was not up for discussion. You can barely walk, she'd said. I can walk to a courthouse, he'd said. Slowly, but I can walk. Tom, I will not lie in this cabin while my sister stands alone in front of a circuit judge, he'd said. That is not negotiable, Emily. Don't argue with me about it. She hadn't argued. She was afraid of that too, of seeing Thomas in that room on his feet when he shouldn't be spending himself for her. She pressed her eyes shut and tried to breathe. She heard footsteps in the hall, not hurried, just someone awake at a late hour moving through the house the way people do when sleep won't come. They stopped outside her door, then quietly, Miss Carter. The Duke. She sat up. Yes. I saw the light under your door, he said. I'm sorry to disturb you. You're not disturbing me, she said. I wasn't sleeping. A pause. May I speak with you a moment? She got up and opened the door. He was standing in the hall in his shirt sleeves, no coat, no formality, holding a small candle, and the light made him look less like a duke and more like a man who also couldn't sleep. I wanted to say something before tomorrow, he said. And I didn't want to say it in front of Crew or anyone else. She waited. He looked at her directly, Whatever happens in that courtroom tomorrow, he said, I want you to know that it changes nothing here. Not your position, not your brother's care, not the reference I promised you. Charlotte Whitmore can file every complaint she wants to file. She does not get to determine what happens in my household. Emily looked at him. That's a significant thing to say, she said. It's a true thing, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Are you afraid? She asked. She wasn't entirely sure why she asked it. He seemed to consider the question seriously. I'm not afraid of the outcome, he said. He stopped, started again. I dislike watching someone be treated unjustly when I know the truth. I have considerable power in this county, and almost none of it is useful in a courtroom. That's a frustrating position. She looked at him. You testified to Crew on my behalf, she said, about my character. He mentioned it. Yes. That mattered. It was the least I could do, he said. She looked at the candle in his hand. She thought about the hat. She thought about Thomas's voice, be careful with yourself. Good night, Your Grace, she said. He nodded. Good night, Miss Carter, he said. Sleep if you can. She went back in and closed the door. She didn't sleep much, but some. The Hargrove County Courthouse was a white clapboard building on the main street of town, and it was full. Emily had expected people. She had not expected this many. The benches packed on both sides, faces she recognized from the Whitmore household, and faces she'd never seen. And faces that belonged to the particular category of person who attended public proceedings because they constituted entertainment in a county where entertainment was scarce. She walked in beside Crew with her back straight and her hands steady. She saw Charlotte immediately. Charlotte was seated at the plaintiff's table with Mr. Pruitt beside her, and a man Emily didn't recognize, her own lawyer, presumably on her other side. She was dressed carefully in a dark blue dress that communicated seriousness without ostentation, and she was looking at the window rather than at the door when Emily entered. She looked when Emily was halfway down the aisle. Their eyes met. Charlotte held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away. Emily sat down. She heard from behind her the sound of someone settling slowly onto a bench, the careful movement of a man who was managing pain and not letting it show in his face. She didn't look. She didn't need to. Thomas was here. She kept her eyes forward. So, Justice Harold Kane was 61 years old, gray-haired, and had the manner of a man who had sat behind that bench for 20 years and had long since stopped being surprised by anything that came before him. He read the complaint into the record without expression, stated the charges, theft of provisions, theft of monetary funds, and looked at both tables over his spectacles. Miss Whitmore, he said, your lawyer will present the complaint. Charlotte's lawyer, a man named Prescott from the neighboring county, stood up. He was perhaps 50, with the confident manner of someone accustomed to courts in counties like this one. He told the story of the missing provisions, the hidden bundle, the confrontation in the kitchen. He told it well, Emily acknowledged. He told it in a way that was factually accurate in all the ways that didn't matter and left out all the ways that did. Then he mentioned the $11.30. The household cash reserve managed by steward Ezra Pruitt, he said, showed a discrepancy of $11.30 over the same 4-month period in which the provisions were taken. It is the plaintiff's position that these two losses are related. Crew beside Emily did not move. Emily kept her face still. Mr. Pruitt, Justice Kane said, you're to testify regarding the household accounts. Pruitt stood. He was a precise man. She had always thought so, the kind of man who wrote things down, who believed that documentation was the closest thing to honesty that paperwork could achieve. He stated his name and his position. He described the cash reserve. He described the discrepancy. And then Crew stood up. Mr. Pruitt, Crew said, in your capacity as household steward who had access to the cash reserve. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Myself, he said. Miss Whitmore. And in certain circumstances, Mrs. Aldridge, the head cook. Miss Carter, Crew said. Emily Carter, the defendant. Did she have access? Pruitt looked at Charlotte. Charlotte was looking at the window. No, Pruitt said. She did not. The room was not silent. There were shuffles, shifts, the small sounds of 40 people adjusting, but there was a quality of attention that sharpened. In 4 months of employment, Crew continued, was Miss Carter ever alone in a room that contained the cash reserve? Not to my knowledge, Pruitt said carefully. Mr. Pruitt, Crew's voice was even. To your knowledge, your direct first-hand knowledge as steward, is there any evidence that the monetary discrepancy in the Whitmore household accounts was caused by Miss Emily Carter? Pruitt was quiet. He was quiet for long enough that Justice Kane looked at him over his spectacles. No, Pruitt said. There is not. Charlotte's hand on the table moved slightly. Prescott was already on his feet. Your Honor, the proximity of these events. Proximity is not evidence, Mr. Prescott, Justice Kane said mildly. Sit down. Tomed, Crew called Emily to speak. She stood up. She walked to the front of the room and she turned and faced all of them, the full room, The faces she knew and the ones she didn't. Charlotte at her table with her hands folded. Thomas on the bench in the third row, with his jaw set and his eyes on her. She looked at Thomas for exactly 1 second. He gave her the smallest nod. She looked at Justice Kane. "Miss Carter," Crew said, "in your own words, why did you take provisions from the Whitmore household?" She told them. She did not dramatize it. She did not soften it. She told it the way it had happened, the letter from the army, the months of believing Thomas dead. Finding him alive in the road outside Culpeper, with a wound that had been left to heal wrong and a body that weighed less than it should. She told them about the cabin, about the walk, about the food she took and why she took it and what she did with it. She told them about the record book. Crew held it up. Justice Kane looked at it. "This is your own handwriting?" Kane asked. "Yes, sir," Emily said. "You kept this contemporaneously. At the time, not after the fact." "Yes, sir, from the first week." He looked at it for a long moment. "You could read and write well enough to maintain medical records," he said. "My father believed in educating his daughters," she said. Something moved through the room. She wasn't sure what. "And your brother," Kane said. "He's here today." "Yes, sir." Kane looked at the third row. Thomas, who was managing not to show how much this was costing him, met the judge's gaze directly. "Son," Kane said, "you were listed as killed in action." "Yes, sir," Thomas said. His voice was steady. "It was an error." "How long have you been recovering?" 6 months, sir, approximately." "Your sister found you?" "Yes, sir, she found me." Kane was quiet. He looked at the record book. He looked at Charlotte Whitmore. Charlotte was looking at her hands, bowing. Prescott made a final argument about community standards and household integrity, and the precedent set by allowing servants to unilaterally decide what provisions they were entitled to take. It was a good argument. Emily acknowledged that, sitting very still at the defense table. It was a good argument because it wasn't entirely wrong. She had taken things that didn't belong to her. She had made a decision without permission and acted on it for months. The fact that her reasons were sound did not automatically make the action sound. Crew's response was brief. "Your Honor," he said, "the defendant took provisions worth approximately $2.40 over a 4-month period. She took them to keep a wounded soldier alive. She documented her actions in real time. She did not deceive anyone about her reasons. When directly questioned, she said in the room that she could not explain in a way they would believe. That's not deception. That's a woman who knew that the truth was too large for the room she was standing in." He paused. "There is no monetary theft. Mr. Pruitt has testified to that clearly. What remains is the question of the provisions, and I would ask this court to consider what kind of county we want to be. One that sends a woman to answer for keeping her brother alive, or one that recognizes that some laws exist to protect property, and some property was in this case used for exactly the purpose that any decent man would hope his property might be used." Justice Kane looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at his papers. Then he looked up. "The monetary claim," he said, "is dismissed. There is no evidence supporting it." He paused. "On the matter of the provisions, I'm going to be direct. You took what wasn't yours, Miss Carter. That's true, and the court takes note of it. It also takes note of why you took it, and of the fact that the household in question has not, to my satisfaction, demonstrated material harm sufficient to warrant criminal sanction." Emily held herself very still. "The complaint is dismissed," Kane said. "Both counts." The room exhaled. Not cheered. This was a courthouse, not a theater, but the collective release of breath from 40 people was unmistakable. Emily sat for a moment. She sat and she breathed, and she held her hands very still in her lap. Then she heard from the third row the sound of Thomas letting out a long, low breath. The sound of a man who has been holding something in his chest for days and is finally setting it down. She turned around. He was looking at her with the expression he'd had her whole life when she'd done something he was proud of and didn't have words for. She nodded at him. He pressed his lips together. She was not going to cry in a courthouse. She was absolutely certain of that. They were outside in the heat of the afternoon when Charlotte appeared. Emily had been expecting it, or something like it had known somewhere in the back of her mind that this was not the kind of woman who walked away from a defeat without one more word. She was standing with Crew when she heard Charlotte's voice behind her, clear and precisely controlled. "Miss Carter?" Emily turned. Charlotte stood 3 feet away. Prescott was behind her looking at his folio. She was alone, in other words, in the way that mattered. Whatever she was about to say, she'd chosen to say it without the armor of a lawyer or a crowd. "You won," Charlotte said, evenly. "The case was dismissed," Emily said. "That's not the same thing." Charlotte looked at her. "You're going to stay at Hargrove Hall," Charlotte said. It was not a question. "For now," Emily said. "And you think what? That this is how this story ends?" Emily looked at her. She thought about the answer to that carefully. She thought about Charlotte in the parlor, with her arms folded and her certainty intact, and her position in the county resting on a set of arrangements she had been constructing for years. She thought about what it must be like to be Charlotte Whitmore, to have done everything correctly, to have built every scaffolding in the right order, and then to watch it develop a crack from a direction you hadn't prepared for. "I don't think I'm in your story," Emily said finally. "I think you've been telling yourself a story in which I'm a threat to something you've built, and I understand why that story makes sense from where you're standing. But I'm not in it by choice, and I'm not trying to take anything from you." She paused. "I'm trying to keep my brother alive and find a way to start over somewhere. That's all I'm doing." Charlotte was silent. "I'm not your enemy," Emily said. "I don't have the luxury of enemies right now." Something moved across Charlotte's face. It was brief, just a flicker, and Emily couldn't fully name it. Not softening. Not quite. More like the particular expression of someone who has heard a true thing and is choosing what to do with it. Then Charlotte looked away. She walked past Emily without another word. Emily watched her go. Crew appeared at her elbow. "That was either very wise or very reckless," he said. "I know," Emily said. "Which do you think?" She thought about it. "Ask me in a few weeks," she said. The Duke was waiting at the edge of the courthouse road. He had not come inside, and she had understood when she arrived and didn't see him that this was deliberate, the same way the hat had been deliberate, the same way all his decisions seemed to be. He had made his moves before the hearing. In the room itself, he had left it to her. He looked at her when she came down the road toward where he stood with the horses. She looked back. "Well," he said. "Dismissed," she said. "Both counts." He nodded once. And then Thomas came down behind her, slowly leaning on the cane he'd been using for 3 days now, and Nathaniel Hargrove looked at Thomas Carter for the first time directly, and Thomas looked back, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then the Duke said, "You're the soldier." "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "Robert Hargrove," the Duke said. "My brother. He served in the same campaign, 18th Regiment." Thomas went very still. Emily felt something shift in the air between them. "I knew a Robert Hargrove," Thomas said slowly. "Not well, but I knew the name." The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He didn't come back," he said. "No, sir," Thomas said quietly. "He didn't." They stood there a moment, two men connected by a war that had taken one thing from each of them and left everything else changed. Then the Duke said, "Can I offer you a ride? The cane suggests the walk might not suit." Thomas looked at him for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." Emily stood between her brother and the Duke and felt the strange, specific weight of a moment when the threads of separate griefs touch each other. She did not name it. She was careful. But she felt it. And somewhere in the part of herself she kept most guarded, something that had been braced for a very long time began very slowly to ease. The ride back from the courthouse was quiet, in the way that comes after something large has passed through and left everyone slightly rearranged. Thomas sat in the carriage with his cane across his knees and his eyes on the road outside the window, and Emily sat across from him, and the Duke rode alongside on his horse, rather than inside with them, which she understood was a consideration giving them the space without making a ceremony of giving it. Thomas didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. Then he said, "You didn't tell me about Robert Hargrove." "I didn't know about Robert Hargrove until 10 days ago," Emily said. "And I didn't think it was mine to tell." Thomas nodded slowly. "He mentioned the 18th Regiment," Thomas said. "I was attached to the 18th for 3 months in the autumn of 1813, before I moved up to the Northern Line." He paused. "There was a Robert Hargrove, quiet man, capable. He died at the crossing, the second one in November. I wasn't there when it happened, but I heard about it." Emily looked at her brother. "Does the Duke know how it happened?" she asked. "I don't know what he was told," Thomas said. "The letters they sent home in those months where they didn't always tell the whole truth. Easier on the families, they said." His mouth tightened. "I never thought that was kindness. I always thought it was cowardice dressed up as mercy." The carriage moved through the afternoon heat, and Emily thought about a man who had received a letter 15 years ago and had spent every year since managing an estate and a title and a silence that was too large to fill. "He's a good man," Thomas said, quietly, not as a question. "I think so," Emily said. Thomas looked at her. She looked out the window. "Emily," he said. "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know what you're going to say, and I'm asking you not to." He was quiet. Then he said, "I was just going to say that you're allowed to let someone be good to you." She didn't answer. She watched the road. Marsh came 4 days later and declared Thomas ready for the procedure. He said it matter-of-factly, standing in the cabin doorway with his bag in his hand, and the morning light behind him, and Thomas received the news the same way he received most things, quietly, with a stillness that was not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. "How long is the recovery after?" Thomas asked. 6 weeks before you're putting real weight on it. 3 months before I'd call you fully healed." Marsh looked at his notes. "You'll have pain during the procedure. I'll give you what I can, but I won't pretend it'll be painless." "I've had worse," Thomas said. "Probably," Marsh said without sentimentality. "Day after tomorrow, I'll bring an assistant. You'll want your sister here." He left. Thomas sat on the edge of his cot and looked at his hands. Emily sat across from him. "Are you afraid?" she asked. He thought about it. "Yes," he said, "but less than I thought I'd be." "Why less?" He looked at her. "Because you're going to be here." She pressed her lips together. "Don't make me cry, Tom," she said. "Then don't ask sentimental questions," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved just slightly, and she felt the particular ache of loving someone so much it sat in your chest like a stone, heavy but warm. The morning of the procedure, the Duke came to the cabin. Emily heard him arrive the horse, the soft knock on the door frame, and she opened it, and he was standing there with 2 things, a flask and an expression she hadn't seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who wants to help and is not sure of the form it should take. "Marsh is good," he said, "if that means anything." "It does," she said. He held out the flask. "Whiskey," he said. "For after. For him, or for you, or both." She took it. She looked at it in her hand. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't planning to. I only—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. "When Robert was wounded the first time, not the last, the first 2 years before he died, I wasn't there either. I was on the estate, dealing with a boundary dispute. Of all the things, a boundary dispute." He said it with a flatness that was more expressive than anger. "I got the letter 3 weeks later. By the time I could have gone to him, he was already back on the line." Emily stood in the doorway and held the flask and looked at him. "He knew you would have come," she said. "Maybe," Nathaniel said. "I'll never know for certain. That's the part that stays." She understood that. She understood it very specifically. "Stay," she said. "Not inside, but stay." He looked at her. "All right," he said. The procedure took 2 hours. Emily held Thomas's hand through the first part of it until Marsh asked her to move back, and then she stood against the wall and kept her eyes open, because Thomas had asked her to stay in his line of sight, and she had said yes, and she intended to keep it. Thomas made almost no sound. He gripped the side of the cot so hard she could see the whites of his knuckles, and once, just once near the end, he made a sound that was barely a sound at all, a compressed exhalation that he swallowed almost before it was out. But his eyes stayed on her face the whole time, and she kept her face steady, and she thought about their father's farm in the good years, when the tobacco came in, and the three of them would sit on the porch in the evenings, and their father would tell stories about his own father, and the world felt large, in the good way, full of room. She thought about that until Marsh said, "Done." Thomas closed his eyes. She was across the room and had his hand before she'd decided to move. "Tom," she said. "Still here." He said, eyes still closed. His voice was scraped raw. "I know," she said. "I know you are." She held his hand, and he let her, and neither of them said anything else for a while. Outside, the Duke was sitting on a stump near the tree line. He was not doing anything in particular, just sitting, hat in his hands, in the posture of a man who had been keeping still by an act of will. He looked up when Emily came out. "Done," she said. "Marsh says it went well." Something went through him, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who wasn't watching carefully. But she was watching carefully. "Good," he said. She sat down on the step of the cabin and put her elbows on her knees. They were quiet for a while. "Tell me about Robert," she said. He looked at her. She had not planned to say it. It had come out of somewhere below the level of planning, the same place that had told her to leave the door open, the same place that noticed the hat. "You don't have to," she said quickly. "No," he said. "I don't mind." He turned the hat in his hands. "He was 6 years younger than me. We were not close as boys. I was being prepared to take the estate, and Robert was being prepared to do something else, though no one was entirely clear what. He was the kind of person who was good at everything without particularly trying, which I found irritating when I was 20 and had to try at everything." He stopped. "When he was older, 18, 19, we were closer. He had a quality, a way of being in a room that made the room feel easier. I don't know how to describe it better than that." Emily thought about Thomas. "I know what you mean," she said. "When he enlisted, I argued with him about it," Nathaniel said, "for weeks. I told him the estate needed him, which was not true. The estate didn't need him. I needed him, but I didn't know how to say that at 29 without feeling ridiculous. So I said the estate." He looked at his hat. "He went anyway. The last thing I said to him before he left was that I hoped he'd reconsidered by the time he reached the recruitment office." The silence that followed had weight. "Did he write?" Emily asked carefully. "Every month, until he didn't." Nathaniel paused. "The letter from the army came on a Tuesday. I remember that specifically. Tuesday, late afternoon, October. I read it standing in the front hall because Fitch had brought it in from the gate, and it had the army seal, and I already knew before I opened it." Emily did not say anything. She just listened. "I think," Nathaniel said slowly, "that I have been running the estate since then as though it were a sufficient answer to something. As though if the operation were large enough, the records clean enough, the fields productive enough, it would fill the space." He stopped. "It doesn't. But I'd gotten accustomed to not noticing that it didn't." Emily looked at him. "Until," she said. He looked at her directly. "Until I followed a servant into the woods one evening," he said, "and found her feeding her brother by candlelight." She held his gaze. She felt something move in her chest, not small, not manageable, something that required genuine effort to hold steady. "Nathaniel," she said. She had not called him that before. She heard it happen, and she couldn't take it back, and she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to. He went very still. "Emily," he said, equally quiet, equally careful. She stood up. "I'm going back inside," she said. "Thomas will want water when he wakes." "Yes," he said. She went inside. She stood at Thomas's bedside and listened to her brother breathe and felt her heart doing something complicated and deliberate in her chest. "Be careful with yourself." She was trying. Thomas began to mend. It happened slowly, and then the way healing sometimes does all at once: a week of fever and stillness, and then a morning when Emily came to the cabin, and he was sitting up without the pillow arrangement she'd constructed to support his back, and his color was better, and he ate a full breakfast without stopping. "You look better," she said. "I feel better," he said. "Which is different from feeling good, but it's an improvement." She sat across from him and watched him eat and felt something unclench in her that had been clenched so long she had stopped noticing it. "We need to talk about what comes next," Thomas said. "Not yet," she said. "Tom, you've been vertical for 4 days. Can we have one morning where we don't plan?" He looked at her. "Fine," he said. "One morning." "Thank you." He ate. She drank the tea she'd brought. Outside, late August was beginning its slow turn, the edges of the heat softening just enough to feel like a promise. "He came every day this week," Thomas said without preamble. "While you were in the library, Marsh told me." Emily looked at her tea. "Marsh told you," she said. "Marsh is not a man who withholds information he thinks is relevant," Thomas said. "Apparently the Duke has been stopping by the cabin each morning before you arrive, checking on the recovery, bringing things." Emily set her cup down. "What kind of things?" she asked. "Yesterday it was a proper blanket, day before a book." Thomas paused. He asked Marsh not to mention it. She was quiet. "Marsh mentioned it," she observed. "Marsh decided I had a right to know," Thomas said. "I'm inclined to agree with him." He looked at her steadily. "A man who brings things quietly without wanting credit for them is a particular kind of man." "Thomas, I'm just saying. You're saying quite a lot for a man who agreed to one peaceful morning." He was quiet. Then he said very carefully, "You have been holding the world together for 6 months, Emily. You are allowed to let someone else hold a corner of it." She looked at her brother, at the face she had been watching her entire life. "I don't know how to do that," she said honestly. "I know," he said, "but I think you're learning." It was Martha who told her about Charlotte's visit. Martha came to the library on a Wednesday afternoon with the expression she wore when she had information she was delivering as an act of friendship rather than gossip, a distinction Emily had learned to read in her. "She came yesterday," Martha said, "while you were at the cabin, stayed about an hour." Emily set down her pen. "What did they talk about?" she asked. "I don't know the whole of it," Martha said. "Fitch says they were in the front parlor with the door closed. But I passed the hall near the end, and I heard her voice, and—" She paused. "She wasn't angry is the thing. She sounded the way people sound when they're trying to say something true and finding it difficult." "What did you hear?" Emily asked. "She said—" Martha thought for a moment. "She said, 'I am not a villain, Nathaniel. I want you to know that I understand that. I am a woman who has done what was required of her, and I expected the same courtesy in return, and I was wrong to handle it the way I did.'" Martha paused. "And then he said something I couldn't make out, and she said, 'I know that now.'" Emily sat with that for a long moment. She thought about what she'd said to Charlotte on the courthouse steps. "I'm not in your story." She thought about Charlotte looking away. "Is she all right?" Emily asked. Martha blinked. "That's an interesting question to ask about the woman who filed a fraud complaint against you." "She's a person," Emily said. "People make poor decisions when they're frightened. I've made a few myself." Martha looked at her for a moment. She seemed— Martha chose the word carefully— quieter than usual when she left. Emily nodded. She went back to the catalog. She thought quietly for the rest of the afternoon about what it cost to say I was wrong out loud to someone who had every reason to agree with you. The letter from Culpeper arrived on a Thursday. Emily was bringing the morning's correspondence to the Duke's study part of her expanded duties, since Fitch had discovered she was faster with correspondence than the previous assistant when she saw it in the stack. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar, but the return address wasn't. Culpeper, Virginia, her father's county, her. She set the stack on the desk in the study and went back to the library and stood for a moment with her hands braced on the catalog table. Culpeper meant the Talmadge family, her previous employer, the one Charlotte had mentioned at the beginning of all this, the family who had given her a reference. But she hadn't written to them. She hadn't wanted anyone from that part of her life drawn into this. She hadn't written to them, which meant someone else had. She went back to the study. The Duke was there now, having come in from the morning's field inspection. He was sorting the correspondence with his usual efficiency, and he picked up the Culpeper letter, and his expression shifted very slightly when he saw the address. He looked at her. "Did you write to anyone in Culpeper?" he asked. "No," she said. He opened the letter. He read it. She watched his face. It was doing the careful, contained thing it did when something required attention. Not blankness, but focus. The face of a man processing information and deciding what to do with it before he spoke. He held it out to her. She took it and read it. The letter was from a man named George Talmadge, the eldest son of the family she'd worked for in Culpeper, who was now managing the family's affairs. It was 2 paragraphs. In the first, it stated that a representative of the county circuit court had written to them requesting information about Emily Carter's employment, apparently as part of Charlotte's preparation for the hearing she'd been building toward even before the dismissal from Whitmore Hall. In the second paragraph, George Talmadge said that he had responded honestly to the court's inquiry that Emily Carter had served his family for 18 months with complete integrity, that no provision or funds had ever been found missing, and that she had left their employ only because the family's circumstances had changed and they could no longer maintain full staff. And then, in a sentence that Emily read twice, and then once more, to be sure, he said, "My mother has asked me to add that if Miss Carter is in need of a character reference for any purpose, she has it unconditionally and without reservation." Emily lowered the letter. She was not going to cry. She was in the Duke's study in the middle of a workday. She was absolutely not going to cry. "Mrs. Talmadge," she said. Her voice came out almost normal. "She sounds like a formidable woman," Nathaniel said. "She is." Emily set the letter on the desk. "She taught me how to manage household accounts. She said every woman should know how money worked because at some point in every woman's life, a man was going to try to tell her she was wrong about it, and she needed to be able to prove otherwise." She stopped. She said it like it was practical advice, not bitterness. "Was it both?" Emily said. Simultaneously, something moved through Nathaniel's expression. That adjacency to amusement that she had come to recognize the thing that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "I had someone write to Culpeper before I offered you the position," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "You mentioned it." "I didn't mention that George Talmadge's response when I wrote asking about you was 4 paragraphs long," he said. The 4th paragraph was unprompted. He said, he picked up his own correspondence from the side table, found a letter, read aloud. "I don't know your reasons for inquiring about Miss Carter, but I'll say this plainly. If you are considering her for a position of responsibility, you will not find a more capable or more honest person in this part of Virginia. If you are considering anything that might cause her difficulty, I'd think carefully before proceeding." Emily stared at him. "He threatened you," she said. "Mildly," Nathaniel said. "Politely. But yes." She looked at the letter in his hand. She felt something that was so large and had so many parts that she couldn't name it all at once: gratitude, which she was accustomed to pushing away, and something warmer than that, which she wasn't sure she had a right to yet. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. He set the letter down. "Because I've been careful," he said, "about what I tell you and when." Because I was aware from the first evening that you had very good reasons to distrust most things that came from a man in my position, and I didn't want to give you information in ways that felt like pressure." He looked at her steadily. "But Thomas is mending. The case is dismissed. Charlotte has made her peace, or something approximating it, and I find that I am no longer willing to be as careful as I have been." The study was very quiet. Outside the sound of the estate in late morning horses, someone calling across the yard, the distant rhythm of fieldwork. "What does that mean?" Emily asked. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. "It means," he said, "that I would like to say something directly, if you'll permit it." She looked at him. "Say it," she said. "I have spent 15 years managing this estate," he said, "and doing it competently, and finding it almost entirely insufficient as a life. I have been not lonely. I don't think that's the right word. I have been empty of something I couldn't name because naming it required acknowledging I needed it." He paused. "And then I looked out a window one night and saw a servant walking into the woods with her apron full of food, and I followed her, because I thought I had a thief, and I found instead the most determined, most honest, most quietly extraordinary person I have encountered in 15 years of encountering people." She did not move. "I am not speaking as your employer," he said. "I want to be clear about that. This is not a conversation that carries any weight or consequence for your position here. If you tell me to stop, I will stop, and nothing changes. But I would like—" He stopped. He was not a man accustomed to sentences that didn't know where they were going. She could see him in the terrain of it navigating. "I would like the chance to be more than the man who helped you, because he felt he owed it to a brother he couldn't save," he said. "That's what I would like. I thought you should know." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have been moving toward a point and have finally arrived at it, and need a moment to understand where they are. Emily looked at the catalog on the table beside her. She thought about Thomas one morning, where we don't plan. She thought about Mrs. Talmadge. Every woman should know how money worked. She thought about the hat. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I have been keeping myself together by not letting much in for a very long time, and I'm not certain I've entirely worked out how to stop." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop all at once." "What are you asking?" He thought about it. "Permission," he said. "To keep being present. To see what that becomes." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the empty space that power left. She thought about her own empty space, different in shape, different in origin, but the same quality of hollow. "All right?" she said. "All right," he said. She went back to the library. She catalogued 12 books before she realized she was smiling. 3 weeks after the procedure, Thomas walked to the main house on his own. He arrived on a Tuesday morning without telling Emily he was coming. She looked up from the library table, and he was in the doorway with his cane and his better color, and the expression of a man who has done something mildly dramatic on purpose. "You walked," she said. "I told you I'd walk," he said. "From the cabin to the main house is a quarter-mile, Tom." "I know," he said pleasantly. "I counted." She stood up. He held up his free hand. "Don't fuss. I'm fine. I came because there's something I want to say to the man of this house, and I didn't think it should wait any longer." Emily looked at her brother. At the stubborn line of his jaw, at the way he stood with the cane, like it was temporary rather than necessary, at the version of himself he was insisting on becoming again. "He's in the study," she said. "Good," Thomas said. He went down the hall. She stood in the library doorway and listened to his knock and the door opening, and then the sound of two men's voices low. She couldn't make out the words. And then what might have been a pause, and then something that from this distance sounded almost like a laugh. Thomas's laugh. She hadn't heard it in 6 months. She sat back down at the table. She looked at the catalog. She picked up her pen. And she felt for the first time in as long as she could remember that the future had a shape she could almost see. Not certain, not guaranteed, nothing in this life ever was. But present, real. A thing that existed in front of her, rather than simply the absence of disaster. She had come to Hargrove County with nothing but a change of clothes and 14 cents and a brother who needed her. She had been accused, dismissed, summoned, tried, and told in a dozen ways by a dozen people that she was less than what she was. And she was still here. Still straight-backed. Still with her record book, and her catalog, and her father's accounting mind, and every piece of herself she had refused to put down no matter how heavy it got. She looked at the library around her, the rows she had organized, the system she had built, the books, standing in their correct places. She thought about what Nathaniel had said. The most quietly extraordinary person I have encountered in 15 years. She thought about the hat. She allowed herself very carefully to feel it. All of it. The warmth of it. The weight of it. The realness of it. She was not going to waste it by being afraid of it. She had been afraid of enough things for long enough. She picked up her pen and went back to work. And somewhere down the hall, her brother was laughing with a man who had gone looking for a thief and found something else entirely. And the summer of 1815 began slowly and without ceremony to become something other than the worst year of Emily Carter's life. Thomas left the study after 40 minutes. Emily knew because she counted not deliberately, just the way she counted things, the way her mind had always kept its own quiet ledger of time and distance and what things cost. She heard the study door open and his cane on the floor, and she kept her eyes on the catalog until he appeared in the library doorway. He looked different. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to and named precisely. But something in him had settled the particular quality of a man who has said something that needed saying and found it received. "Well," she said. "We talked," Thomas said. "For 40 minutes. We had things to discuss." She set down her pen. "Thomas?" He came into the library and sat in the chair across from her table, slowly with the cane, but steadier than he'd been a week ago. He looked at her with the gray-green eyes that had always been able to find the thing she was trying to keep to herself. "He asked my permission," Thomas said. Emily went very still. "He asked—" She stopped. "He asked you to court you," Thomas said. "Formally. He said he'd already spoken to you, and that you'd given him a conditional answer, and that he thought it was right to come to me as well. Not as your owner or your keeper, he was very clear about that, but as the person who knew you best." She looked at her brother. She did not know what she looked like in that moment, but she suspected it was something Thomas would describe later to someone as the first time he'd seen his sister genuinely surprised in her adult life. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said that you were the most capable person I had ever known," Thomas said, "and that you had spent the last 6 months keeping me alive at considerable cost to yourself, and that if he caused you one moment's suffering that wasn't necessary, I would find a way to make that clear to him, regardless of my current mobility." He paused. "And then I said yes." Emily looked at the table. "He asked you," she said again more quietly. "He said something else," Thomas said. "He said that he was aware that your position here had begun as a necessity, and that he wanted to be certain you understood the difference between staying because you had to and staying because you chose to. He said he wanted to make sure the choice was real." She pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry in the library either. It was apparently going to be a recurring challenge. "He's a careful man," she said. "He is," Thomas agreed. "I respect that." He looked at her steadily. "You're allowed to be happy, Em. I need you to know I mean that. Not eventually, when everything is resolved and the situation is tidier. Now, as things are." "Things are fairly good right now," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm saying, let them be." She looked at her brother for a long moment. "Go back to the cabin," she said. "Rest. You walked a quarter-mile today, and you're trying to tell me you're fine, but your left hand is white around the cane." He looked at his hand. "I am fine," he said. "Relatively speaking," she said. "Go rest, Tom." He went. She listened to his careful steps down the hall and the front door, and then she sat in the library alone and felt the full exact weight of what had just shifted in the world. She found Nathaniel in the stable yard an hour later. He was talking to the head groom about the autumn pasture rotation, the kind of conversation that was entirely about horses and land, and had nothing to do with her. And she waited at the edge of the yard until he finished, and the groom went back toward the stable, and he turned and saw her standing there. He walked toward her. She waited. When he reached her, she said, "You asked Thomas." "Yes," he said. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him. She had looked at this man many times in the past weeks, across the library table, across the courthouse road, in the dim hall at midnight with a candle, and each time she had been looking at him through the careful glass of everything she was managing. The situation, the cost, the risk, the angle of every choice. She was tired of the glass. "Walk with me," she said. He fell into step beside her without ceremony. They walked along the east edge of the property where the fields gave way to a line of old oaks, and she told him what she had been thinking about for 3 days, since the conversation in the study that she had walked away from too quickly because she hadn't been ready. "I grew up in a house where my father loved my mother plainly," she said. "He didn't make speeches about it. He was present, consistently present. He would stop what he was doing to listen to her, and he remembered what she said, and he made decisions with her instead of around her." She paused. "I knew from watching them what it was supposed to look like. I just didn't expect to find it." Nathaniel was quiet beside her. "I have not been looking for it," she continued. "I want to be honest about that. I came here looking for survival. For a wage and a roof and enough time to get Thomas back on his feet. I was not looking for anything else." "I know," he said. "And then you followed me into the woods," she said. "And found you feeding your brother by candlelight," he said. "Yes." "You took your hat off," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't aware that was significant," he said. "It was the most significant thing anyone had done for me in 2 years," she said. "I stood in that doorway, and you took your hat off, and it was such a small thing, and it was everything. Because nobody in that whole long stretch of months had looked at what I was doing and treated it as something worth treating with respect. They called me a thief. They called me a liar. Charlotte called me a social climber. And you took your hat off." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because you said you wanted the chance to be more than the man who helped out of obligation. And I think you deserve to know that the chance already happened. Somewhere between the hat and the midnight whiskey and telling Charlotte in your front hall that I wasn't a thief, it already happened. I just needed time to be sure of it." He looked at her. "Are you sure of it now?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Then may I—" He stopped. The man who never started sentences without knowing where they'd go, stopped. She loved that the specific evidence that she could do that to his sentences. "May I take your hand?" he said. "Just that, for now." She looked at him for one long moment. Then she held out her hand. He took it. They stood at the edge of the oak line in the late summer afternoon, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was the most peaceful Emily Carter had felt in 3 years. The county found out. The way counties always found out, not through any announcement, not through any single moment, but through the accumulation of small observations. The way the Duke stood when Emily was in a room. The way she had her own chair at the study table, now, not a servant's chair, but an actual chair with her own correspondence tray beside it. The way Fitch spoke to her quietly, carefully, with the tone of a man who had recalibrated his understanding of the household. Martha told her without being asked that the talk had changed. "It changed before the hearing, actually," Martha said over tea in the kitchen on a September morning. "When he stood up in his front hall and said what he said to Miss Whitmore. That got around." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "People in this county have known Nathaniel Hargrove for 15 years. They know what he is. And when a man like that says the bravest person I know about a dismissed servant girl, people notice. What are they saying now? Emily asked. Some of them are saying it's too fast, Martha said honestly. Some of them are saying she must be clever, meaning it's an insult. Some of them are saying it's about time somebody got through to him. She looked at Emily. But mostly they're saying it quietly, which means they're watching to see what kind of story this becomes. And what kind of story do you think it becomes? Emily asked. Martha smiled. The good kind, she said. The kind people are glad happened even if they weren't sure at the time. October came in fast that year. The heat broke in the last week of September, and the county shifted into autumn, the air sharp, the fields browning at the edges, the mornings arriving earlier in the dark. Thomas moved out of the cabin and into a room at Hargrove Hall. It was Nathaniel who suggested it. He said it to Emily first, which she noted not as a transaction, not presenting it to Thomas as a settled decision, but asking her first in the study one evening. The cabin is adequate for summer, he said. It's not built for cold. The north wall doesn't hold heat. I know, Emily said. She'd been thinking about it. There are rooms in the east wing, he said. They've been unused since my parents died. They're sound. They're warm. He looked at her steadily. It's not charity. He can help with the estate records when he's well enough. He has experience organizing supply lines. That's the same skill, different application. I have a winter account situation that has needed attention for 6 months. Emily looked at him. You thought about this, she said. I think about things, he said. You thought about how to offer it in a way Thomas wouldn't refuse, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. He's a proud man, Nathaniel said. I respect that. So I found the thing that was true, which is that I genuinely need the accounts work done, and that gave him a reason other than charity. She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about what Martha had said, the good kind, the kind people are glad happened. Yes, she said. Ask him. Thomas said yes. He said it the way he said things that mattered briefly, with a single nod that communicated more than a paragraph would have. He moved in on a Wednesday, and by Friday he had found the estate's winter accounts and reorganized the filing system without being asked. Nathaniel came to Emily in the library and said with the particular expression of a man whose instinct has been confirmed, "Your brother is going to be extremely useful." I know, she said. He's been useful his entire life. The army just didn't give him enough to do. Oh, it was November when Charlotte came back. Not on official business, not with a lawyer. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon without notice and asked Fitch if she might speak with Miss Carter. And Fitch, who had his own opinions about things, now came to find Emily in the library and told her in a neutral tone that left the decision entirely to her. Emily thought about it for 10 seconds. I'll come out, she said. Charlotte was in the front parlor, sitting straight-backed in a chair near the window, wearing a dark green dress and an expression that Emily could not immediately classify. Not hostile, not precisely warm either. Something in between the expression of a woman who has decided to do something difficult and has committed to seeing it through. Emily came in and sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. I don't want to take much of your time, Charlotte said. I came because there's something I needed to say in person, and I decided I'd been putting it off long enough. All right, Emily said. Charlotte looked at her directly. I was wrong, she said, about the money. That was, I had convinced myself that the cash discrepancy was connected, and I convinced myself because it was convenient to believe it, and I let a court proceeding go forward on the basis of something I did not actually know to be true. She paused. That's not a small thing. I understand that. I filed a fraud allegation against you that had no evidentiary basis, and I did it because I was frightened, and I wanted you removed from a situation I found threatening. Emily said nothing. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Charlotte said. I'm telling you it was wrong, and that I know it was wrong, and that I've known it since Prewitt testified. She stopped. I needed you to hear me say it plainly. Without a lawyer in the room, without an audience. Just this. Emily looked at Charlotte Whitmore, at the careful composure she maintained, at the real effort underneath it, at the person who had made a series of poor decisions, from a position of genuine fear, and was now sitting across from the consequence of those decisions, and looking at her directly. "I hear you," Emily said. Charlotte nodded. "Is there anything—" She stopped, started again. "Is there anything I can do? To correct it, or to— I know a formal apology won't undo what it cost you. But if there's something specific—" "There is one thing," Emily said. Charlotte looked at her. "There's a woman in this county," Emily said. "A widow, Mrs. Elaine Forbes. She's been trying to get her husband's land claim recognized by the county clerk for 8 months. The clerk keeps finding procedural delays. Her husband served in the same campaign as my brother." She paused. "You have connections with the county clerk. A word from your family would resolve it in a week." Charlotte blinked. She had been expecting something else. Emily could see it, the recalibration of a woman who had prepared for one conversation and was having another. "That's what you want?" Charlotte asked. "That's what would be useful," Emily said. "I don't need anything from you personally, but Mrs. Forbes needs her land." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "I'll write to the clerk tomorrow," she said. "Thank you," Emily said. Charlotte stood. She looked at Emily for a moment, a long, real look, the kind that doesn't have an angle. "He's a good man," she said quietly. "Nathaniel, I wanted that for myself. But I think—" She stopped. "I think he needed someone like you, not someone like me." She said it without bitterness and without performance, just plainly the way true things sometimes come out when you've been carrying them long enough. Emily stood. "I'm sorry," Emily said, "that it worked out this way." "Don't be," Charlotte said. "I'm managing." She picked up her gloves. "I'll see myself out." She did. Emily stood in the front parlor after she left and listened to the sound of the horse on the drive and felt the particular quality of a story resolving not perfectly, not without cost, but fully. The way things are when everyone has finally said the true thing. The proposal came on a Sunday in late November. Emily would not have predicted Sunday. She would not have predicted the kitchen garden either, which was where she happened to be when it happened. She had taken to walking there in the early morning, before the house was fully awake, because it was quiet, and because the smell of the turned earth reminded her of her father's farm, and she had been doing it for 3 weeks without mentioning it to anyone. Nathaniel found her there, which meant he had been paying attention to where she went in the early morning, which meant he had been watching over her without making a production of watching over her. She was going to feel that for a long time. He came around the corner of the garden wall and stopped when he saw her, which told her he hadn't planned this particular moment. He'd come looking for her and found her and was now deciding in real time. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He came to where she was standing near the dormant herb beds and stood beside her, and they looked at the garden for a moment in the manner of two people who have become comfortable enough with each other that silence doesn't require filling. Then he said, "I've been thinking about the question of the future." "So have I," she said. "What do you see?" he asked. "When you think about it." She considered. "Thomas," she said. "Healthy, working, himself again, or a version of himself that's made peace with what the war cost him." She paused. "The library finished, the catalog complete. Maybe a new project after that, because I seem to require a project." She stopped. "And," he said. He knew there was an and. She looked at the dormant garden. "You," she said. "In the picture, somewhere near the center of it." He was quiet. She could feel him beside her, the particular presence of him, the specific warmth of standing next to a person who has decided you are worth standing next to. "I would like to make that permanent," he said, "if you would allow it." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with the full attention she had come to understand was how he showed things not through elaborate expression, but through the quality of his regard, the way he was entirely present in this moment and nowhere else. "I don't have a ring," he said. "I intended to acquire one properly, and this is not how I planned this conversation. But you're standing here, and the morning light is, and I find I can't wait any longer for the right arrangement of circumstances." He paused. "Will you marry me, Emily Carter?" He said it without the upward lilt of uncertainty. Not because he was presuming the answer she understood, but because he meant it fully, and the meaning didn't require the hedge of a question mark. She looked at him. She thought about the hat. She thought about 14 cents, and a change of clothes, and a walk into the Virginia darkness that had been the worst walk of her life, and the one that had, by a course of events she never could have mapped, led here. She thought about her father on the porch in the evenings. "Yes," she said. He closed his eyes for a single second. Then he opened them, and she saw what he looked like when he allowed relief in the way it moved through his face. The thing that came after the careful control relaxed just for a moment. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. They stood in the cold kitchen garden in the November morning and held on. The wedding was in January. Thomas walked her in. He walked without the cane. He had been working without it for 3 weeks. But this was the first public occasion, and Emily had told him he didn't have to prove anything, and he had told her to stop fussing, and they had arrived at the church door in the particular comfortable argument of two people who have been arguing their entire lives and would not trade it for anything. The church was fuller than she'd expected. Mrs. Talmadge had come from Culpeper, had written to say she was coming, had arrived the day before, and embraced Emily in the front hall of Hargrove Hall with the efficiency of a woman who expressed affection through action rather than speech. Martha was there, and Fitch and Marsh, who sat in the third row, with the expression of a man who has participated in a recovery and is not unhappy with the outcome. Deputy Crane was there in the back, which Emily noticed, and found she did not mind. She did not look for Charlotte. Charlotte was not there. But the week before the wedding, a note had arrived, brief in Charlotte's precise handwriting, saying that Mrs. Elaine Forbes had her land claim recognized and that the county clerk had processed it without delay. Emily had read the note and folded it and kept it. Some things didn't need to be said out loud to matter. Thomas brought her to the front of the church, and Nathaniel was standing there in his good coat, looking at her with the expression she had come to know as his version of overwhelmed, and Thomas put her hand in Nathaniel's and stood back. Justice Kane, who had agreed to perform the ceremony with the dry good humor of a man who appreciated the full arc of a story, said the words that had been said at the front of churches in Virginia for 100 years. When he reached the part that asked whether she consented, Emily said yes, with the full weight of a woman who had earned the right to say it, who had carried everything alone and learned when to set it down, who had known her own worth when no one else would name it, who had walked into the dark with 14 cents and her father's accounting mind and come out the other side, not rescued, but recognized. Nathaniel held her hand through the whole of it. He did not let go. That evening, after the guests had gone, and Thomas had retired to his room, and the house was quiet in the way it was only in the deep winter nights when the county slept, Emily stood at the library window and looked out at the dark. Nathaniel came and stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She thought about it. "I'm thinking about the walk," she said. "The walk from the cabin at midnight through the east field. I did it so many times I stopped feeling it. And now I'm standing in a warm room and the field is out there, and it's strange to be on this side of a thing you thought might break you." He was quiet beside her. "It didn't break you," he said. "No," she said. "It didn't." She looked at the dark field. "It just made me very certain about what mattered." He put his arm around her. She leaned very slightly against him. Not the lean of someone who needs holding up, but the lean of someone who has chosen with full knowledge of the choice to be close to another person. Outside, the Virginia winter held the land in its quiet grip. Inside, the fire was warm. Thomas was healing. The library catalog was 3/4 done. And Emily Carter, who had come to Hargrove County with nothing and had refused, through every cold morning and dark night and public humiliation and private terror, to become less than she was. Emily Carter had built something real in the only way real things are ever built. Not by being rescued, not by being lucky, but by standing straight when everything pushed her to bend, by knowing her own worth when the world called it theft, by walking into the dark again and again and again, until the dark became a path she knew by heart. And when someone finally came who was worthy of the door she opened, she had let him in. That was the whole of it. That was every bit of it. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.